At zero, 400 hours on a damp October morning in 1962, the residents of Limavady in County Londonderry were woken, as they had been for more than a decade, by a sound that carried across the Roe Valley like rolling thunder held in place. 4 Rolls-Royce Griffon engines, each driving a pair of contra-rotating propellers, were being run up on the dispersal pans at Royal Air Force Ballykelly. The aerodrome sat 6 miles from the town, on the southern shore of Lough Foyle. The distance made no difference. Windows rattled in their frames. Cattle in the surrounding fields were known to stampede. One local publican, interviewed by the Belfast Telegraph in 1964, described the morning departure of a full squadron as the end of the world arriving on schedule. The aircraft responsible was the Avro Shackleton, a long-range maritime patrol machine built for Coastal Command and later Number 18 Group of Strike Command. Its acoustic signature was not merely loud, it was mechanically peculiar. Each Griffon produced roughly 2,450 horsepower at takeoff, driving 2 three-bladed propellers rotating in opposite directions on a common shaft. The tip speeds of those blades, measured by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough during trials conducted in March 1951, exceeded 990 feet per second. That figure sits only a whisker below the speed of sound at sea level. When propeller tips approach that threshold, they generate a thick, beating pulse rather than a clean rotational hum. Multiply that pulse by 8 propellers operating slightly out of synchronization, and you have the Shackleton's characteristic throb, audible, according to one oft-repeated claim by former crewmen from 20 miles distant on a still night. Group Captain John Roberts, who commanded No. 204 Squadron at Ballykelly between 1958 and 1960, wrote in his unpublished memoir held at the Royal Air Force Museum Hendon under accession No. X004/771 that the noise was a physical thing, a presence in the aircraft, and you learned to live with it because you had to. His squadron flew the Mark Two variant with its twin-wheel undercarriage and chin-mounted radar on patrols that routinely exceeded 12 hours over the North Atlantic. Each of those hours, every man on board absorbed a sound pressure level that would today trigger the immediate evacuation of any industrial premises in the United Kingdom under the Control of Noise at Work Regulations, 2005. The Shackleton served in frontline Royal Air Force roles from April 1951, when the first Mark I was delivered to No. 120 Squadron at Kinloss, through to the final withdrawal of the Airborne early warning. Mark II from No. 8 Squadron at Lossiemouth in June 1991. 40 years on the strength. More than 180 aircraft built at Avro's Woodford and Chadderton plants. And at every station where it served, the same story emerged from the signallers, the navigators, the flight engineers, and the air electronic operators who flew it. After 2 tours, something in their hearing had gone, and it was not coming back. The reasons for that loss and the service's response to it form the substance of what follows. The Shackleton's origins lie in a specific operational requirement issued by the Air Ministry in March 1946, designated Specification R5/46. Coastal Command needed a replacement for the American-built Consolidated Liberator General Reconnaissance Mark VI and the wartime Handley Page Halifax General Reconnaissance Mark VI, both of which were being withdrawn as Lend-Lease obligations and fatigue concerns forced their retirement. The Admiralty, increasingly nervous about Soviet submarine construction at Leningrad and Severodvinsk, wanted an aircraft capable of 15-hour sorties out into the western approaches and beyond. Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, proposed a solution rooted in a proven bloodline. Chadwick's team at Chadderton, working through the autumn of 1946, took the wing of the Avro Lincoln, itself a stretched and strengthened development of the Lancaster, and married it to a new, deeper fuselage built to accommodate 10 crew, a mission-specific electronics suite, and a substantial weapons bay. The Lincoln's Merlin 85 engines were discarded in favour of the larger, more powerful Rolls-Royce Griffon 57, the same family of engine that had propelled the late-war supermarine Spitfire Mark 14 and the Fairey Firefly to their operational peak. The choice of the Griffon, and more specifically the decision to couple it to contra-rotating propellers manufactured by de Havilland, was driven by a straightforward aerodynamic calculation. Contra-rotating units eliminated the torque effect that made single-propeller Griffon installations so challenging, and they extracted more thrust from a given engine diameter. The penalty, not fully appreciated at design stage, was acoustic. Chadwick did not live to see the aircraft fly. He was killed on the 23rd of August 1947 when the prototype Avro Tudor II he was aboard crashed on takeoff from Woodford, the aileron controls having been crossed during overnight maintenance. Design leadership passed to Stuart Davies, and the first prototype Shackleton, serial VW026, made its maiden flight from Woodford on the 9th of March 1949 in the hands of Avro's chief test pilot, J. H. Orrell. The aircraft was initially designated the Lincoln Mark III, a bureaucratic sleight of hand intended to simplify funding through the existing Lincoln program. Only in 1950, with production already underway, was the name Shackleton formally adopted, honouring the Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, whose endurance in hostile conditions was thought an appropriate association. The lineage mattered because it dictated the cockpit layout, the crew positions, and the fundamental structural philosophy. A wartime heavy bomber had been asked to become a long-endurance maritime patrol platform, and the compromises ran through every compartment. Crew positions were scattered along the fuselage in an arrangement inherited from the Lancaster's 7-man establishment, now expanded to 10. Soundproofing consisted of thin aluminium inner skins and small quantities of Roxel mineral wool, batting in the wing roots and engine bulkheads. The original Lancaster had carried its crew on missions of perhaps 8 hours. The Shackleton was being asked to carry them for nearly double that, with 4 engines of significantly greater displacement and a propeller arrangement that produced a wholly new category of cabin noise. By the summer of 1951, the first Mark I squadrons, number 220 at Kinloss and number 120 at St. Evil in Cornwall, were working up to operational status. The aircraft would serve the Royal Air Force for the next 4 decades. Nothing about its acoustic character would meaningfully change. Measurements taken inside a Shackleton Mark II during cruise flight, recorded by the Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough in a study conducted between April and September 1959, produced figures that the presiding medical officer, Wing Commander E.J. Dennison, described in his final report as without precedent in service aviation. The dominant sound pressure level at the navigator's position, measured with the Griffon engine set to 2,200 revolutions per minute at 12,000 feet, registered 126 decibels on the A-weighted scale. At the signaler's station, further aft and closer to the propeller plane, the reading climbed to 130 decibels. At the tail gunner's position in the Mark I, the figure fell slightly to 122 decibels, though this was counterbalanced by the gunner's exposure to the airstream through the open observation panels. To place those numbers in context, a Rolls-Royce Merlin-engined Lancaster at cruise produced cabin levels of approximately 110 decibels. A Vickers Viscount airliner of the same era sat closer to 85. The decibel scale is logarithmic. Each increase of 10 represents a tenfold rise in acoustic intensity. The Shackleton's interior was therefore producing sound energy roughly 100 times greater than a contemporary civil turboprop, sustained for the entire duration of a sortie. The mechanical origins of this acoustic environment were specific and once understood, unavoidable. The Griffon 57, Mark A, fitted to the Mark Two, had a displacement of 2,240 cubic inches, driving a reduction gearbox that stepped the crankshaft speed down to the propeller shafts at a ratio of 0.442 to 1. The de Havilland contra-rotating unit, designated Type H5/30/40, mounted two 3-bladed propellers of 13 feet diameter on concentric shafts. The forward and rear propeller discs were separated axially by only 10.5 inches. Each blade of the rear propeller therefore passed through the disturbed wake of a forward blade 6 times per revolution. At 2,200 revolutions, this produced a blade passage frequency of roughly 220 Hz, sitting squarely within the most sensitive region of human hearing. Compounding the problem, the wing structure transmitted vibration directly into the fuselage. The Griffon's characteristic firing order generated a low-frequency pulse at around 60 Hz, which set up resonances in the fuselage skin panels. Crew members reported a physical sensation in the chest cavity, a beating that could be felt through the seat and the soles of the flying boots. The headsets issued to Shackleton crews offered almost no meaningful protection. The standard Type G helmet, introduced in 1958, used foam ear seals that provided attenuation of perhaps 15 decibels in the mid-frequency band. The dominant acoustic energy, however, lay below 500 Hz, a region in which the Type G's passive attenuation fell to under 8 decibels. Flight engineers often removed their headsets entirely during transit phases, preferring the raw noise to the thin, distorted communications audio overlaid upon it. Cotton wool, rolled into plugs and sometimes soaked in Vaseline, circulated as an unofficial remedy. Squadron leader Peter Lagan, later officer commanding No. 2, 101 Squadron, wrote that one simply accepted one would spend the rest of the flight shouting and the rest of the week deaf. The operational context that demanded these long, deafening sorties was the widening maritime confrontation between the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the submarine force of the Soviet Northern Fleet, headquartered at Polyarny on the Kola Peninsula. By 1956, Admiralty intelligence assessed that the Soviet Union possessed some 475 operational submarines, a figure that substantially exceeded the Kriegsmarine's wartime peak. The majority were conventional diesel-electric boats of the Whiskey and Zulu classes, built at Gorky and Severodvinsk, and their operational patrol routes took them southwest through the gap between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, the stretch of water that Whitehall came to designate the GIUK Gap. The Shackleton squadrons were assigned the central task of detecting, tracking, and, in the event of war, prosecuting those submarines. From the mid-1950s onwards, the operational pattern settled into a routine of barrier patrols flown from 4 principal stations. Royal Air Force Kinloss on the Moray Firth housed numbers 120, 200, and 201 squadrons. Royal Air Force Ballykelly in County Londonderry operated numbers 203, 204, and 240 squadrons at various points. Royal Air Force St Mawgan in Cornwall hosted the Maritime Operational Training Unit, and a detachment at Royal Air Force Gibraltar covered the western Mediterranean approaches. Further afield, No. 37 Squadron operated from Cormacsar in Aden, and No. 205 Squadron from Changi in Singapore, both roles demanding transits of extraordinary duration. The sensor fit evolved considerably across the aircraft's service life. Early Mark I airframes carried the ASV Mark 13 radar, a derivative of the wartime centimetric sets used by Coastal Command against the U-boats. The Mark II introduced the ASV Mark 21, mounted in a retractable ventral dustbin that could be lowered in flight to clear the lower fuselage structure. From 1966, the Mark III Phase 3 upgrade brought in a more capable search radar, and crucially, the Autolycus diesel fume detector, a passive sensor that could sniff the exhaust traces left by a snorkeling submarine. Sonobuoys, dropped through a chute in the rear fuselage, provided acoustic detection once a target had been localized. The weapons bay could carry up to 9,000 pounds of ordnance, typically a mixture of Mark 44, homing torpedoes, and depth charges. A representative patrol profile, drawn from the operations record book of No. 204 Squadron for the week commencing the 11th of February 1963, held at the National Archives at Kew under reference Air 27/3096, shows Shackleton Mark II WL 796 departing Ballykelly at 06:15 hours. The aircraft flew northwest to a patrol box centered on 60 degrees north, 15 degrees west, conducted a box search of approximately 4 hours at 2,000 feet, and returned via a track that took it close to Rockall. Total sortie time, 13 hours and 40 minutes. A contact was briefly held on radar at 10:22 hours, prosecuted with sonobuoys, and classified as a probable Whiskey-class boat on surface transit. Multiply that pattern across 4 squadrons, each flying perhaps 120 sorties per month at peak operational tempo, and the cumulative exposure of the crew force becomes apparent. A typical first tour, 3 years on strength, delivered close to 2,000 flying hours. A Shackleton sortie began long before the engines turned. Crews reported to the squadron operations room some 4 hours before takeoff, received the meteorological briefing from the station forecaster, and drew their flight rations from the mess. These rations, standardized across Coastal Command from 1957, consisted of a sealed tin containing corned beef sandwiches on Hovis bread, a slab of Dundee cake, 2 apples, a bar of plain chocolate, and a vacuum flask of tea made to service specification at ratio of 6 ounces of loose leaf to a gallon of water. A second flask held oxtail soup. 10 such tins were loaded aboard each aircraft, 1 per crewman, secured in a metal rack aft of the galley position. The galley itself was rudimentary, a single electric hot plate, drawing power from the aircraft's 24-volt direct current bus, could heat a kettle or warm a tin. The signaller, whose station sat nearest the galley, acquired by convention the duty of brewing tea at intervals throughout the flight. The Elson chemical toilet, positioned in the extreme rear of the fuselage behind the tailplane bulkhead, was a matter of some practical concern on sorties exceeding 12 hours. Its use in turbulence required a particular technique, and the smell, once it escaped the confines of the chemical reservoir, tended to migrate forward through the fuselage as the flight progressed. Former crewmen, interviewed for the Imperial War Museum's oral history program in the 1980s, spoke of the Elson with a mixture of resignation and gallows humor. The crew establishment of 10 men rotated through duty positions across the length of a sortie. The 2 pilots exchanged the controls at roughly 2-hour intervals. The 2 navigators, one plotting tactical positions and one handling the astronavigation, worked alternating watches. The flight engineer monitored the engines continuously, though he too was relieved for rest periods. The three signallers, later redesignated air electronic operators, divided their attention between the radar, the radio, and the sonobuoy equipment. The two gunners, in Mark One days, manned the nose and tail turrets. On the Mark Two and Mark Three, with the turrets deleted, they were reclassified as additional AEOs. Sleep was taken on a single bunk, aft of the main spar, which was unheated and vibrated continuously. Most men found genuine rest impossible and settled instead for a dull half-consciousness that passed the time without restoring the body. The cold was pervasive. Shackleton cabin heating relied on a combustion heater fitted in the starboard wing root, which functioned intermittently and rarely raised the rear fuselage temperature above 5 degrees Celsius at operational height. Crews flew in full cold weather kit, string vests, roll neck pullovers, Mark IV flying jackets, canvas trousers, and fleece-lined flying boots. The oxygen system, required above 10,000 feet, drew from banks of cylinders mounted in the rear fuselage. Flight Lieutenant Michael Dickinson, who flew with No. 120 Squadron between 1961 and 1964, described a 15-hour sortie in a piece written for the Kinloss Station magazine in the summer of 1963. "You climbed out at Lossiemouth," he wrote, "with your kit bag, your rations, and your hearing. You returned with the kit bag and the rations. The hearing stayed out over the Atlantic somewhere, and it took several days to find its way home." The Royal Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine at Farnborough, established in its post-war form in 1945, carried the responsibility for investigating the occupational hazards of service flying. Its files on the Shackleton, many of which have been progressively released to the National Archives under the 30-year rule and subsequent Freedom of Information requests, paint a picture of growing concern among service medical officers that was not always matched by corresponding action at the policy level. The first systematic audiometric survey of Shackleton aircrew was conducted in 1954 by squadron leader E.D.D. Dixon, a specialist in aviation otology at the Royal Air Force Central Medical Establishment in Kelvin House, Cleveland Street, London. Dixon tested 112 aircrew drawn from numbers 120 and 220 squadrons, comparing their audiograms against pre-service baselines where available, and against a control group of ground personnel from the same stations. His report, submitted to the Director General of Medical Services in February 1955, identified a consistent pattern of sensorineural hearing loss centered on the 4 kHz frequency band, the classical signature of noise-induced damage. The mean threshold shift at 4 kHz among crewmen with more than 1,000 Shackleton flying hours was 28 decibels. Dixon recommended the urgent development of improved hearing protection and the introduction of mandatory 6-monthly audiometry for all operational aircrew. The response, documented in Air Ministry file Air 2/16489, was cautious. The Director of Flying Training raised concerns that routine audiometric screening might disqualify experienced crews at a time when the Coastal Command order of battle was already stretched. A compromise was reached. Audiometry would be conducted annually at the crewman's home station, but threshold shifts of up to 30 decibels at single frequencies would not, of themselves, warrant removal from flying duties. The decision was, in retrospect, a significant one. It permitted a generation of Shackleton aircrew to continue accumulating flying hours in an acoustic environment that was already known, at medical officer level, to be causing measurable damage. Subsequent studies reinforced the picture. A follow-up survey conducted at Royal Air Force Halton in 1963 by Wing Commander J. L. Hunsaker, drawing on audiograms from 347 Shackleton crewmen, found that the mean threshold shift at 4 kHz had risen to 34 decibels after 2 operational tours, equivalent to approximately 4,000 flying hours. A meaningful proportion of the cohort, approximately 11%, exhibited threshold shifts exceeding 40 decibels across the 3 to 6 kHz band, a level consistent with moderate permanent hearing impairment. Hunsaker's conclusions were blunt. The Shackleton operating environment, he wrote, produces hearing loss at a rate that cannot be mitigated by the hearing protection currently available to aircrew. The service response was incremental. The Type G helmet was supplemented from 1964 by the Mark II Amplivox ear defender, a foam-filled cup worn beneath the helmet that provided an additional 5 to 7 decibels of attenuation. Cotton wool remained in unofficial use. No operational decision was taken to reduce sortie lengths or to curtail the exposure of individual crewmen. The medical files were retained. The patrols continued. The audiograms, year upon year, told the same descending story. The Shackleton's maritime patrol role ended with the introduction of the Hawker Siddeley Nimrod Mark One, the first of which was delivered to No. 201 Squadron at Kinloss in October 1969. By the middle of 1972, all 4 front-line Coastal Command Shackleton squadrons had re-equipped, and the type was expected to pass quietly into retirement. That expectation was overturned by an unrelated requirement emerging from within Strike Command. The Royal Navy's Fairey Gannet Airborne Early Warning, Mark III, which had provided fleet air defence warning from the decks of Royal Navy carriers, was being withdrawn as the carrier force itself was run down. HMS Ark Royal, the last fixed-wing carrier capable of operating the Gannet, would pay off in 1978. The Royal Air Force, inheriting the Airborne Early Warning mission for the defence of the United Kingdom airspace and the fleet, required an interim platform pending the introduction of the Nimrod AEW Mark III, then in early development at Woodford. The decision, taken at a Cabinet Office Defence and Overseas Policy Committee meeting in November 1971, was to convert 12 surplus Shackleton Mark II airframes to carry the Gannet's AN/APS-20 search radar in a large Chinra dome. The resulting aircraft, designated Shackleton Airborne Early Warning Mark II, entered service with No. 8 Squadron at Kinloss in January 1972, subsequently moving to Lossiemouth in August 1973. The APS-20, an American-designed set dating from the late 1940s, was already obsolescent at the time of its installation. It suffered badly from sea clutter, had limited resolution against low-flying targets, and required the aircraft to fly a tight racetrack pattern at the edge of its detection range to maintain coverage. The radar operators, working at a pair of scopes in the rear fuselage, described the task as looking for a moth in a snowstorm through a pair of reading glasses. No. 8, Squadron's operational role took its aircraft into the airspace north of the Faroe Islands, providing early warning of Soviet Tupolev Tu-95 Bear reconnaissance aircraft transiting southwards from bases on the Kola Peninsula. Interception was the business of the English Electric Lightning, later the McDonnell Douglas Phantom FGR Mark II, vectored onto the target by the Shackleton's fighter controllers. The cat and mouse pattern became a defining feature of the North Atlantic during the late 1970s and the first half of the 1980s. The aircraft by this point were aging badly. The youngest AEW airframe had been built in 1954. corrosion was endemic, particularly around the wing root fittings, and the structural integrity of some aircraft was maintained only through an extensive rolling programme of spar replacement carried out at British Aerospace Bitterswell. The Griffon engines remained serviceable, but spares were increasingly scarce. Number 8 Squadron resorted, by the mid-1980s, to cannibalising retired airframes stored at Lossiemouth and at Royal Air Force Shawbury. The Nimrod AEW programme collapsed in December 1986 after cost overruns and irreconcilable technical problems. The Boeing E-3 Sentry was ordered as replacement in late 1986, but delivery would not begin until 1990. Number 8 Squadron was therefore obliged to continue operating the Shackleton until the first Sentry entered service. The final operational sortie was flown from Lossiemouth on the 30th of June 1991. The consequences of 4 decades of Shackleton flying began to appear in the service pensions files long before the type was withdrawn. The Ministry of Defence's War Pensions Agency, based at Norcross, near Blackpool, received its first substantial wave of noise-induced hearing loss claims from former Coastal Command aircrew in the late 1970s, as men who had flown the Mark I and Mark II variants during the 1950s and 60s reached early middle age and began to notice the practical cost of their service years. The pattern of those claims was remarkably consistent. Claimants in their late 40s and early 50s presented with bilateral sensorineural hearing loss centered, as Dixon and Hunsaker had predicted decades earlier, on the 3 to 6 kHz band. Tinnitus was almost universal. Many reported a particular difficulty in following conversation in crowded rooms, a condition audiologists term cocktail party deafness, arising from the loss of high-frequency acuity that normally permits the brain to separate a single voice from background noise. Wives of former aircrew, interviewed for a 1992 study at the Royal National Throat, Nose and Ear Hospital in Gray's Inn Road, described husbands who turned the television volume to levels that neighbours found intrusive, and who had withdrawn from social occasions they had previously enjoyed. The War Pensions Agency's initial response was inconsistent. Some claims were accepted on the basis of service audiograms retained in the individual's medical record. Others were rejected on the grounds that the claimant could not establish that his hearing loss was attributable to service flying rather than to age, civilian noise exposure, or unrelated medical conditions. The burden of proof, as the system then operated, rested with the claimant. For men whose service records had been partially destroyed in the Ministry of Defence fire at Arnside Street, Walworth, in 1975, the evidential difficulties were acute. The Royal Air Forces Association, acting through its welfare officers at regional level, took up the cases of individual claimants from the early 1980s onwards. Its pressure, sustained over more than a decade, eventually secured a significant policy shift. By the mid-1990s, the presumption in favour of attributability for aircrew who had flown specified noisy aircraft types, the Shackleton explicitly among them, had been effectively reversed. Claims from Shackleton veterans, supported by contemporary audiograms or even by squadron service records alone, were thereafter routinely accepted. Compensation, when granted, took the form of a war pension at a percentage rate reflecting the degree of disablement. A 20% assessment, typical for moderate bilateral loss with tinnitus, yielded at 1996 rates a payment of approximately £28 per week, index-linked and tax-free. For men whose hearing loss had ended careers in civil aviation, merchant shipping, or the police service, the sum was a modest acknowledgement rather than a full restoration. The Shackleton Association, formed in 1982 and still active from its office at Hayfield in Derbyshire, maintains a register of surviving aircrew. Its welfare committee estimates that more than 90% of members report significant hearing impairment. At the annual reunions, held variously at Kinloss, Lossiemouth, and Coventry, a particular pattern of social behaviour is observable. Conversation takes place at close quarters, at elevated volume, and with a great deal of lip reading. The men who flew the loudest aeroplane in Royal Air Force history carry its signature still,